right, we are almost at the end of the semester, and we are going to cover the nervous system. So, nervous tissue like nerves, the organization of the nervous system, and then we'll look a little bit more closely at the central and peripheral divisions of the nervous system. And then next week, we will wrap up with the somatic and autonomic divisions of the nervous system. So, a little bit closer look into how those function and how they control different aspects of our body. But for now, we're just going to get used to what's going on with the nervous system. So starting off with section 2, like normal, we are going to look mostly at structures of neurons, kind of look at gray and white matter, and kind of how gray and white matter look differently, what's causing them to look differently. And then we'll look briefly at some of the divisions of the nervous system and different parts of those different divisions. So first off, nervous tissue is made up of neurons and glia, and we'll go into a bit more detail about those here as we go. Basic structure of a single neuron is made up of a soma, which is the special name for the cell body for nerves because they have some other structures that most other cells don't have. And then there are processes, which are extensions of that cytoplasm outwards from that cell body. And again, those are the structures that most other cells in the body don't have. These processes can be classified as dendrites if they are receiving information, or axons if they are carrying information from that soma, from that cell body elsewhere. The axons can be covered by a very lipid-rich sheath called myelin, and then the cell bodies of neurons are going to cluster together in regions that are either going to be called nuclei or ganglia, depending on where they're found within the body. The axons of neurons are usually going to bundle together in structures called tracts. So these are columns, or nerves, which are fibers. So the word nerve, like the nerves that we learned last week in lab, those are not a single neuron cell. That is a bundle of the axons of multiple neuron cells. And again, the name, so what they're called, is going to depend on their location within the body. So here's that basic structure of a neuron. So we have the soma right here, that cell body. It's going to have those dendrites projecting off of it. And that, again, is going to be receiving information. And then here's our axon. And we're going to coat that in myelin very frequently, and then we can have additional projections off of that axon. This is usually what is going to connect with the dendrites of another neuron cell. So gray and white matter. This was named based on its kind of appearance and composition, so it is going to look darker or lighter, and the gray matter is made up of densely packed soma, so all of those cell bodies of neurons. It's usually going to be located on the superficial covering of the entire brain, and then there's also a few regions deeper down of the brain, so the nuclei of the brain, and then deep within the spinal cord. So we saw that gray matter within the spinal cord, that kind of butterfly-shaped structure. And then white matter is made up of where all of the axons are located, and it looks a lot lighter in color, not just because it's made up of axons, but because it has a lot of that myelin covering it, which again is a lipid substance, so a fat-like substance. So that myelin is going to look really, really light colored, just like a lot of fats and greases and stuff like that do in real life. So that white matter is going to be located very deep within the brain, but very superficial on the spinal cord. So here is a cross section of a brain. So this kind of clear covering that you can kind of sort of see, that's actually the acronoid mater that we talked about in lab last week. And so you can see all these different sulci and gyri. But if we do that cross section, and you'll learn a couple of these, so you'll learn these different layers in lab this week. So just really quickly right now, so we can see how this has a darker color to it. So that's all of the soma, all of those cell bodies packed in together, whereas the rest of this is all of those myelin covered axons. And so you will learn these layers in lab. So this gray matter out here, this thin layer, that is the cerebral cortex. And then down in here, the name for this area is pretty easy. This is the central white matter. All right, so we do have different ways of dividing up the nervous system, and usually those are going to be grouped into structural divisions and then functional divisions. So structural divisions of the nervous system are going to be broken up into the central and peripheral branches of the nervous system. So the central nervous system, or CNS, is just the brain and spinal cord. This is where we are processing and integrating the signals coming in from the rest of the nervous system and triggering responses to that information. And then the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is made up of the ganglia and nerves that are outside of the brain and spinal cord, and they are going to be sensing our external and internal environment, sending that information into the central nervous system, and then initiating or carrying out those responses that are received from the central nervous system. So breaking that up visually, here's our brain. Spinal cord obviously is going to be all there. That's making up that central nervous system. Then the peripheral nervous system are going to be those cranial nerves that we learned in lab last week, spinal nerves, and then the ganglia themselves. We have those sympathetic ganglion all the way down the spinal column. So those are all part of the peripheral nervous system. So ganglion, nuclei, nerves, tracts, we've kind of talked a little bit about these, and I mentioned a couple slides ago that the same structure can have a different name depending on where it's found within the body, and that is going to be based on its structural division and where it's located within those two different divisions. So neurons, so those nerve cells, are located within ganglia, which is the plural of ganglion, within the peripheral nervous system. And then in the central nervous system, those neurons are bundled together in nuclei, or into a nucleus for that singular. And then those projections off of the neurons are going to be called tracts or columns when they are within the central nervous system, and then nerves when they are outside of that CNS. So that's why we have peripheral and cranial nerves, so spinal nerves and cranial nerves, but we don't have nerves within the central nervous system because those structures are tracts or columns. So here are three basic functions of the nervous system, which are sensation, integration, and response. So sensation is picking up sensory information from changes in the external and internal environment. So being able to sense temperature, something that's touching us, being able to sense when we're getting, too much sun exposure and things like that, those are all external environment sensors. But the internal environment, most people don't think about this, but internal environment, we're sensing mostly unconsciously. We're not really paying close attention to this a lot, but hunger would be an internal environment sense. So your body is sensing that your blood sugar is getting a little bit too low and you're going to need to eat very, very soon so that it can keep functioning at its best. So that is going to end up being in our conscious perception, but it doesn't necessarily start out that way. Other sensors would be for the bladder receptors. So when do you need to go to the bathroom? There's also sensors of making sure that your food that you do eat is moving through the digestive system properly. That's not something you're really going to be aware of. So these different changes are called stimuli, and so they're perceived by our peripheral nervous system and then sent to the central nervous system for integration. So those stimuli coming into the central nervous system is going to get processed by the brain and spinal cord depending on what information it is and where it's coming from. It gets processed, and then the central nervous system is going to initiate some sort of response. So it's seeing that information and saying, this is what we need to do to fix this or work with this or accommodate or whatever it is. And that is our third basic function, is response. So motor responses to stimuli, so movement of skeletal muscles, and then movement of either cardiac or smooth muscle, or even glands, which are going to be involuntary responses, whereas our skeletal muscle response is entirely voluntary. Next up, we have functional divisions of the nervous system. And so this is less about where the location is of this tissue and more, what is it doing for our body? How is it helping us to maintain homeostasis? Because that is our body's ultimate goal, is maintain homeostasis. And we have three main divisions functionally, which are the somatic, autonomic, and enteric divisions of the nervous system. So we'll talk more about the somatic and autonomic branches next week. We're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into them next week in lecture, but really quickly right now, the somatic division is responsible for our conscious perception and then our voluntary motor responses. So this is our skeletal muscle. And so this is going to include both sensory ganglia, because we need to be able to sense what's going on so we can respond to it. Structures of our special senses like sight, smelling, touch, taste, hearing, those are all special senses. And then also the brain, spinal cord, and nerves are going to be a big part of this functional division and all of the other functional divisions. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for our involuntary movements. So one way of remembering that is autonomic means automatic. These are things that happen without us having to be aware of it or think about it in any way, shape, or form. It is automatically happening whether we want it to or not. So we have special neurons in the brain and spinal cord, as well as cranial and spinal nerves and some autonomic ganglia that are involved in this particular division of the nervous system. So we'll look more at that next week. And then our third division is the enteric nervous system. And this is a special division that is responsible for those involuntary movements of smooth muscle and glands within the digestive system specifically. So the enteric nervous system is sometimes thought of as a subdivision of the autonomic division, because this is still involuntary. This is still an automatic response and sensation of what's going on in our digestive system and controlling that. So the sensory neurons in our somatic division, these are responsible again for conscious perception of external changes like smell, taste, touch, etc. Visceral sensory neurons are responsible for our unconscious perception of external and internal changes like blood pressure, temperature regulation and stuff like that, fluid balance, so how much water do we have in our body. And then we have our somatic motor neurons. These are for responding. So if you smell something really, really good coming from the kitchen, you may get up and walk to the kitchen to see what it is. And those are all within that somatic division. So we're sensing, and then we are responding to that. And then the autonomic motor neurons are responsible for those involuntary movements of cardiac and smooth muscle tissue, as well as glands like sweating. So this table just kind of summarizes all of that. And so again, each of these functional divisions involves both sensory neurons, so we need to be able to sense external and internal environment, That integration is going to happen mostly within the central nervous system, with the exception of that enteric division. That information does get processed directly within the gastrointestinal tract, which is part of the peripheral nervous system. But then the flip side of that is those motor responses. So this is the information we're picking up. This is where it's getting processed, and this is what happens as a result of that. And obviously, this is all happening very, very quickly. All right, we are not usually consciously aware of how fast these responses happen, because our nervous system does need to work really, really quickly, in most cases, to keep us safe. All right, that wraps up section 2. We will continue the chapter in the next video, looking at some more anatomy of different nervous tissue.